this video, we will continue our series, providing a preliminary defense against those who doubt the veracity of the Islamic Hadith tradition. More specifically, a series of hypercritical points raised against Islamic mass transmission will be addressed. The opponent to whom we are responding first attempts to use the statements of Yasir Qadi regarding the companions who preserved the sacred prophetic tradition. It must be noted that Yasir Qadi's statements are not binding upon Muslims and are not accepted without the associated evidence. Nevertheless, they will be briefly evaluated. This will be followed by our own further analysis to a series of weak, fallacious, and inconsistent objections to the idea of mutawatir, that is, mass-transmitted narrations. The first statement criticized with respect to this issue by Dr. Qadi is as follows. He says, literally, only 4 to 5 of the Sahaba narrated the bulk of the tradition. We stress a few points. Firstly, the idea of it being a bulk of the tradition is merely a rough estimate based upon the samples that he himself conducted. Not only do we not know how large these samples are, but we do not know if these samples were properly conducted. Dr. Yasir does not specialize in the studies of hadith. We do not grant that he went over every single report and decided this figure. We would first need to know his methodology, and we need to see whether it aligns with a methodology with which we would agree. Keeping this in mind, a bulk could really reflect what is only about 1/4 of the actual corpus, or slightly more. The opponent simply exaggerates the statement of Dr. Qadi for nothing more than rhetorical purposes. In addition to this, when considering the nature of the traditions, it becomes clear that even granting this would not affect the Islamic position. The ahadith are based on the statements, actions, commands, and more of the Prophet ﷺ. Just a surface analysis of our sources refute the idea that it's merely 4 to 5 companions preserving this, although this will be expounded upon later. From these select companions, we see that Aisha, the wife closest to him, Abu Hurairah, the man who stayed day and night with the Prophet, and was part of Ahl Sufa, a group of ascetics whose life was centered around learning the prophetic traditions, Umar, the second caliph of the Muslims, just to name a few. So, even if the number of companions was quite small, these men and women were perfectly placed to know and transmit the prophetic tradition, much like the apostles of Jesus were. Christian apologists first need to come up with an objective number at which we can stop doubting the transmissions of the Prophet's closest associates. They know they cannot, however, because the sources for Jesus are 4 Gospels, which themselves are not independent and regularly contradict and change each other. So, if they have an issue with 4 to 5 companions for the Islamic tradition, they should apostate and become Rabbinic Jews who claim to have dozens of witnesses for the Torah and oral Torah going back to Moses, which both contradict Christian doctrine. Thus, as the Christians claim for the apostles, we claim for the companions, and so the Holy Prophet ﷺ and his activities throughout the day from morning till night can be realistically recorded and transmitted. Moreover, the tradition is also inclusive of reports attributed to other than the Prophet ﷺ, like the teachings and rulings and events that his companions transmitted independent of the Prophet. Hence, it is perfectly fine, therefore, to accept that a bulk can come from a handful without undermining the preservation of the religion. Here, it is not the number of companions that matter, but whether we'd expect these specific companions to truly preserve his daily activities based on their relations with the Prophet. For example, at night, when he is at home or in the morning, his wives would narrate from him. During prayers, his companions would narrate. Additionally, refer to our previous video for a brief, practical example on how early Muslims did not simply fabricate legal opinions, but only used them when it was necessary and they had access. The second statement of Dr. Yasser, which they quote, is as follows: 90 to 95% of the Sahaba are not known to us. It is important to first define who the Sahaba are. A Sahabi, to some, is defined as anyone who met the Prophet and died upon Islam, not those who narrate. In fact, it has always been known in the Islamic tradition that many of the companions did not narrate, just like the modern-day early Muslims weren't all scholars, and just like early Christians and Jews were not all scholars. It is inconceivable that every individual of a growing religious movement should transmit on the authority of its prophet, as the vast majority will not dedicate their life to the religious sciences. In fact, a Christian should not even be bringing this up unless they can name how many Christians there were pre-100 AD who met Jesus and what their names and locations were. Not a single academic or historian in the world expects this, and further, not a single one sees this to be an issue. The only ones that do are polemicists who have to be taught consistent academic methodology by the Muslims. Finally, unlike Christianity, we know the Muslims were able to conquer a large part of the known world from early on. Hence, we know how the early movement was unified in this way. We also know the differences that arose from early Muslims, so that we may evaluate the beliefs of the early Muslims as a whole. Thus, we can conclude that this point is not relevant to the authority of our tradition and can be safely ignored. The Christian here has brought nonsensical and irrelevant points by appealing to misquoting Yasser Qadhi, a scholar who's not even an authority in the field, simply to discredit the Islamic tradition. The opponent then attempts to refute the Islamic conception of mass transmission with an old, tired argument, which shall now be dealt with. They first claim that a report being reliable is strictly dependent on it reaching tawatur status. They misunderstand the idea of qata'i and dhanni evidence. Ahad hadith are simply fallible historical reports that can be overturned with stronger evidences, like any other historical report, Muslim or otherwise. Mutawatir statements are precisely the form of evidence that are able to overturn them. This does not mean that one can simply reject ahad hadiths, as Dr. Jonathan Brown, in his treatment of this very topic of certainty, states, detractors of the skeptical academic tradition had not understood that in the post-Aristotelian philosophical world, epistemological certainty was a rara avis in everyday life, and not at all to be expected. Thus, this discussion of certainty is merely one of semantics, and is intuitive when one looks at hadith as we do, general history. Ahad reports can be logically rejected, we grant this. However, historical methodologies do not go by what is logically possible, but rather they operate inductively via gnomic judgment, that is, judgments one makes of cause and effect. Consider a chain with 2 to 3 unknowns, a chain with 2 to 3 honest narrators, who are known to have transmitted many reports accurately based on corroboration, and 2 to 3 liars. From a logical viewpoint, there is no contradiction in saying that the 2 to 3 honest narrators could have lied, and the 2 to 3 known liars could have told the truth. But from a historical perspective, we take the chain of 2 to 3 honest narrators, because that is what is more reliable. Much of pre-modern history is based on testimony. The Gospels are supposedly based on testimony. Epistles are written testimony. The examples are endless. And so to say, we need mass transmission for each and every piece of history is mistaken, as we do not apply the standard in everyday life, since we recognize that this is not necessary. Rather, ahad hadiths are historical reports, which can and are overturned with stronger evidence, and mutawatir reports are historical reports which, due to their level of mass transmission, have been rendered epistemically certain and thus constitute the strongest form of evidence. Epistemically, we can reason via probability whether any particular report can be taken as historically reliable. This is much more in-depth and requires a separate video, but to simplify, if we take 100 narrations of an individual and 90% are verified through corroboration, it is very reasonable based on priors to accept the next report that they narrate, even if it is ahad, since their reliability has been consistently demonstrated, and the idea of a narrator transmitting that which is mutawatir and then that which is ahad does not change the priors of their accuracy. Next, they claim that simply because ahad hadith do not produce epistemic certainty on their own, that a mutawatir hadith must also carry this property. This is a basic fallacy of composition brought about by their own ignorance. One property being true for the parts does not imply that the property is true for the whole. As an example, a rope is made up of strictly weak strings. It does not, therefore, imply that a rope is as weak as its strings, because when many strings come together and are tied as a group, they are stronger. As for the news analogy that the opponents bring, it does not necessarily fall within tawatur, as it is possible that only one news report witnessed the event and then conveyed it to many. Per the Islamic principles of jurisprudence, this form of testimonial does not fall under tawatur. Hence, the analogy fails, and rather shows the incompetence of our opponents. Finally, the opponents mention the issue of legality within Islam by bringing the idea that the statements of individual Sahaba are hujjah due to the fact that their students would ask for legal opinions, and they would answer them without claiming it went back to the Prophet. Firstly, there is a difference of opinion concerning whether the opinion of a companion without evidence can be used as an evidence itself within rulings. Of the four major Sunni madhabs, the Shafi'i madhab does not take the uncorroborated opinion of a companion as evidence. Hence, the idea of rulings being without evidence from companions does not affect the truth of Islam, but simply the principles of specific schools, legal schools of thought from Islam. However, since the dominant position is that the opinion of a companion can be used, we will demonstrate their arguments. From those 7 major companions is Aisha, the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. She reported an estimated 2,000 reports. It is reasonable, based on this, to say that the rulings she shares are based on those many reports she narrated. To say that it is not based on that assumes dishonesty from her. To that we say, such suspicion must arise from a particular reason. What is that reason? If our opponents cannot provide a reason, then they have no basis to argue against us. We also raise a second point. Many of the rulings of the companions established are based on analogical reasoning, which are based on intellectual efforts and not strictly textual. So, what sort of evidence is the opponent expecting? Such needs to be specified. We would spend more time addressing this had our opponents brought about legitimate issues and arguments, but as usual, they have failed to do so. In fact, one may use their logic of rejecting a Sahabi's statements as a hujjah to reject the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15. Readers of that chapter will realize that James and Peter never relied on a statement of Jesus, and instead used their own interpretations of prophetic text and legal reasoning. To an Orthodox Christian, this is legally binding. Yet through our opponent's methodology, this must be rejected. We want our viewers to note that every single one of the arguments presented against Islam today can be applied to the Christian faith and the apostles. Our opponents are thus either dishonest, ignorant, idiotic, or perhaps a combination of all three. They do not know how to research properly, which is why, from their hatred of Islam, they consistently end up with fallacious, pseudo-intellectual arguments. In the next episode, we will be tackling a specific set of fiqh objections, inshallah.